Welcome to Written Words and today's lesson, which comes to you from the beautiful city of Lincoln in the East Midlands of England. As far as cities go, Lincoln is a rather small one, although what it lacks in size it makes up for with the richness of its history. Anyone who walks from the modern part of the city at the bottom of the hill up the main street and over the cobbles of the very aptly named Steep Hill, will see this history coming to life as they make their way up towards the cathedral and the castle at the very top. There has been a settlement here since prehistoric times, and it has since been home to Celts, Romans, who called it Lindum, Angles, Saxons, Vikings and Normans, and it has seen more than one bloody battle which has decided the fate of the entire country. Lincoln Minster is arguably the most impressive cathedral in the country, despite being one of the lesser known on the tourist trail. It was first built by Bishop Remigius in the 11th century, and it was at one point, for about 200 years, the tallest building in the world. Although it no longer holds that title, it is still certainly impressive and can be seen from many miles away, as mentioned by the 17th century traveller Celia Fiennes. She says, "Lincoln opens to view at least 6 miles off. It stands on a very high hill and looks very fine. At the entrance, the houses stand compact together. The streets are but little, but it's a vast hill to ascend into the town where the minster stands. By that means it's very perspicuous and eminently in view a great many miles off." The cathedral is magnificent on the outside and on the inside, and there is a lot to see and learn there. There are a selection of guided tours that you can take depending on what it is that you would like to find out. There is even a queen buried in the cathedral. It is home to the partial remains of Queen Eleanor, wife of Edward I, and it's also home to the cheeky Lincoln imp, who is carved into the stone at the top of one of the columns, and the Lincoln imp has become the symbol of Lincoln. Outside in the cathedral grounds there is a statue of Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was originally from the area, from Lincolnshire, having been born in the nearby village of Somersby. On the base of the statue is one of his verses. "Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is." Next to the cathedral, on the opposite side of Ermine Street, the original Roman road which led from the south to the north of the country, stands the castle, and this is another building steeped in history. William the Conqueror commissioned its building shortly after the Norman conquest, due to its strategic location. So it is almost 1,000 years old now, and it has been in use ever since it was built. After serving as a fortress for centuries, it became the county prison in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the prison buildings are now a museum explaining the story of the castle. And the castle also serves as the county court to this day. The castle is also now home to one of the 4 surviving copies of Magna Carta, a historic document from the time of King John in 1215. While I was doing some research for this lesson, one of the books that I looked at was this rather old copy of The Story of Lincoln. It's a history book telling the story of Lincoln from prehistoric times until what was the present day at the time of writing. The book was written in 1939, so of course more chapters have been added in the city's history since then. But as I was reading the opening chapter, I rather enjoyed the way the author presents the scene at the beginning of the book. It's almost cinematic in the way he describes zooming through the timeline of the city backwards from the present day, as it was then, all the way back to prehistoric times. So let's just have a little look at the opening few lines of this book. Lincoln is a very old town, one of the oldest in England. Suppose for a minute we stand still and imagine ourselves flying back through the ages, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, and still more, to the times when Lincoln began. What changes should we see? Before we had flown back 100 years, we should notice the city getting smaller. The factories, for instance, would be gone, as also would a large number of houses on the industrial side of the town. The straggling suburbs also would disappear, and in their places would be meadows and cornfields, and in a very short time, say by 1830, the railways would vanish, and instead of the busy city of 70,000 people, which Lincoln is today, we should have a quiet country town, white with apple blossom in spring. It was known as the City of Orchards, with coaches, country carts, flocks of sheep, pedlars and pack horses wending their way along the muddy roads to market. But we are far, very far from the beginning of Lincoln. To get there, we must fly in great leaps of 200 or 300 years at a time. But what a succession of great and exciting events we shall see. Although this book was written many decades ago now, the opening still has lots of impact and is still intriguing to a modern reader. The cinematic effect is a device we still enjoy in books and films today. So how does the author use language to create this effect and to make it entertaining as well as informative? First of all, he talks about flying back through the ages. He's talking about time travel, which is something that excites our imaginations. And then he lists 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. The number of years is getting higher and higher and more exciting, more and more mysterious as we, in our imaginations, travel back further and further through time. Then he turns from numbers to looking at the visual scene and what we can see when we look down below at the city going back through time. He tells us the things we can see, or rather the things that are disappearing. The city's getting smaller. The factories are disappearing. Some of the houses are disappearing. The suburbs disappear. The railways disappear. And in their place, we see a much more pastoral, rural scene. In place of the houses and the factories and the railways, we have meadows and cornfields and apple blossoms and flocks of sheep and pack horses and muddy roads. This is only the first paragraph, of course. The whole chapter carries on in a similar vein as we travel further and further back through history, and the author points out lots of significant events in history that have taken place here until we arrive back at pre-Roman times, about which we know a lot less. And now for our language focus. Just as a city like Lincoln changes over time, so does language. Going back to our story of Lincoln, let's just look at the first two sentences of the book's foreword. It says, "For 3,000 years, men have been living on the hill where Lincoln stands today. During all that time, they have been engaged in the great task of organising their common life in the form of a rude Celtic village, a Roman city, or a self-governing municipality." The words there are quite understandable to a modern reader, but it is clear that the language in there is not quite the same as we would use now. For example, in the first sentence he says that for 3,000 years men have been living on the hill where Lincoln stands today. So a modern reader might wonder, if men have been living there for 3,000 years, what's happened to the women? A reader in 1939 would understand the word men to mean human beings in general. But of course the way we use that term now has started to change. So language changes over time. The English language has been shaped over the centuries by all the different people from different countries who have come here and brought their languages with them. There have been Romans, Saxons, Vikings, Normans, and they all brought their language backgrounds with them. Languages are as alive as the people who speak them, and they're still changing and evolving now. So let's look at a few more words whose meanings have altered in recent years. There are certain categories of words which are more open to change as well. For example, technology. Technology is developing all the time, and as a result we need to adapt our language to be able to cope with it so that we can talk about it. So some of the words that already existed but have now acquired an additional meaning because of technology include things like troll, hack, mouse, cloud, tablet, chat, feed, viral, tweet, text. These are all words that existed before the invention of computers, but we've now taken them and given them additional meanings. There are also quite a lot of words which previously existed but which have acquired a meaning relating to sex or sexuality. For example, gay, queer, making love. Then there are a lot of words that are still in use now, but they tend to be used more by the older generation than the younger generation, and therefore in the future they will eventually disappear from usage. Some of the words that I've heard the older generation use, but rarely anyone under the age of 20, include words like awfully, or beastly, or youngsters, flabbergasted, and a favourite one of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister from the 1980s, was poppycock, meaning nonsense. For our writing prompt, we're going to do a bit of historical writing. Imagine it is May 1217, and the French army, led by the Count of Perche, are laying siege to Lincoln Castle. You are an archer in the King's army, the English Royalist army, and you're defending Lincoln Castle. You're standing high up on the battlements with your bow and arrow, ready to defend the castle from the invaders in what is now known as the Battle of Lincoln Fair. Describe the scene that you witness as you look down from the castle walls. If you're not familiar with this episode in history, I will tell you that much of the fighting took place on Ermine Street, the Roman road that goes between the castle and the cathedral. And after a fierce battle, the Count of Perche was killed and the French were driven out of Lincoln, so the English defenders of the castle were victorious. As usual, there is a worksheet to accompany this lesson with all the points we've discussed, the extracts and so on, as well as some recommended reading. We've looked at a very old guidebook to Lincoln in this lesson, but I've also included on the worksheet a reference to this book, Lincoln Cathedral, The Biography of a Great Building, which is a more modern guidebook to the cathedral with lots of information about its history and some beautiful illustrations as well. Thank you very much for joining me in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy writing.